I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Seth Baily. Seth has been with OAG since 2014 as responsible for growing the customer base and introducing new products. Seth is going to talk about flight capacity, what's next, and how to plan for ongoing volatility, the subject I'm sure we're all wrestling with at the moment. Over to you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Veovo for having me. So what I'm here today to speak about is flight capacity. So flight capacity, a number of different elements. So not just with schedule data, but status data and bookings as well. So I am the VP of Business Development for OAG. Like Chris said, I've been with OAG for about 6 years. And what we have been doing during this great time of volatility is really trying to measure capacity and measure the implications of the capacity to the flight status data and also the booking world to get a good measurement of demand. So that's kind of what I'm here to talk about and share OAG's insights with you today. So here's a quick rundown of the agenda. I'm going to show you the data sets that OAG has, how they can be implemented into the Veovo world. We're going to take a look at forward-looking capacity, so mainly scheduled data there, operated flights, so how cancellations and gray flights, otherwise known as unknown flights, factor into your modeling for future capacity. Future bookings, so bookings made down the line to kind of get a good idea of market demand. And then the automated process with our data sets and how they kind of weave into the Veovo world. So this is the data ecosystem that OAG operates in. And what we're going to be speaking about mostly today is schedule data, status data, and booking data. But you can also see in the data world that we have, there's some other complementary data sets. So reference data, so your airlines and airport codes, daylight savings times information, our connection building abilities, so connections data, so seeing where your passengers are coming from on their ultimate journey. The booking data there, which we'll talk about further. On-time performance. So on-time performance data is mainly centered around flight status data. And how you can measure, the on-time performance of your departures and arrivals, not only in your market at your airport, but also within the competitive market that you're working in. Fares data, so kind of complementary to bookings. Fares data is central to the booking process and seeing where the average fares are in your market and how they're trending, if they're going up or down, depending upon the volatility in your market. Fleet data, so how fleet data weaves together with scheduled data, so the timeline of ownership and leasing market in the airline world, so cancellations, orders, that sort of magnitude, with the airlines purchasing and leasing aircraft. And then the second row right there is kind of our churning out of information, so our predictive analytics, our forecasting, which we'll talk about today, our derived data, and our proprietary data that we have. And all this data is, deliverable from OAG into different platforms, like Veovo's flight management platform. Mainly, Veovo gets their data through our APIs, but we also have alerting mechanisms and direct mechanisms. So the direct mechanism is really, raw data file deliveries via Snowflake, which is the data warehousing platform that we use right now. So we allow our clients to pick up their data via Snowflake, do their analytical, processing through Snowflake, or drive it into a third-party analytical tool like Tableau or Power BI to do your visualizations. So allow easeability of exporting the data. So that, in a nutshell, is our cloud kind of data set that we're looking at. So the main event, so global capacity trends. So this graph right here really illustrates the global trend of capacity on a month-over-month basis from 2019 to 2020 to 2021, with the future schedules for 2021 highlighted as well. So you'll see from February of 2021, which is shaded here, the darker yellow, that the comparable numbers from 2020 were still quite a ways below what 2020 was in February. But if you look at March and April and May and June, you can see that the trend for 2021 is trending upward. So you can see that for April, May, and June, we're getting a good scale up of capacity, and even into July. So into your summer months, you're seeing kind of peak capacity for what's on the scheduling database right now. So OAG as a company, we get our schedules directly from the airlines, and we get about a 365-day outlook for our scheduled data. So we can see, into what's scheduled for 2022 also. But right now, we're really focused on the June, May, and April timeframe, because what we've seen generally is that the 60 to 90 day outlook for airlines is where you're going to see your most volatility. So 60 to 90 days before the date of operation for any particular flight is when you're really going to see the reduction in capacity that we're seeing right now. So you're going to see this July, June, May, April, even probably scale closer to what the March number is right now. And the reason for that we found is that the airlines want to put as much capacity as they can for future flights, 60 to 90 days out, and then they're going to trim it back to try and meet that demand. So the demand is really is going to be much lower than what the capacity is showing into the future. So especially further into the future, like the summer months for July and August for 2021, we suspect, unless there's a large influx of bookings and the demand really rises, that those June, August, July, June numbers are going to start to scale down closer to the probably April and March numbers, and finalize around probably the 250, maybe 300 million seat mark. And that's just because of the nature of the uncertainty of demand right now. So the volatility is just there, where you just don't know, you know, you just don't know what the future holds. And the situation is so fluid in the market that capacity changes and capacity decreases come at a very significant rate. This graph right here is showing you scheduled capacity by region week over week. So it's for the baseline is the January 20th, the week of January 20th, 2020. And then we're showing the first 3 weeks in March. And then the percent change week over week from those weeks, and the percent change from January 20th, 2020. So kind of your baseline of how much the decrease has happened still. So the positive news is, in terms of volatility and in terms of capacity, that we're seeing a pretty substantial increase, close to across the board. There are some decreases in Latin America. There's some decreases in the Caribbean, parts of Africa, but your heavy hitters, your North America is up 3.9% week over week. Western Europe 2.1%. Southwest Pacific, so your Australia, your New Zealand, the Pacific Islands, 3.2%. So we're seeing good growth week over week in the month of March. But I'll point your attention to the percent change from what we call, the good times pre-COVID. We're still down a significant amount. So the capacity across the globe is still about 44% down from January 2020. Granted, that number is actually getting better. That number is actually decreasing, because we've seen numbers in the 60s and 70 percentile earlier in 2020 or towards the end of 2020. So the great thing is that that number is coming down, but we're still so far off the good times base mark that we have a long way to go, even though there's positive sentiment in the market, and there's an increased positive sentiment from airlines and airports. And I know that in North America on Sunday of this, I believe it was Sunday, the 14th of March, the TSA processed 1.3 million passengers through their security gates, which had been the highest since January of last year. So there is positive sentiment. More people are traveling. The capacity is increasing, but we still have a very, very long way to go. So the next data set I want to talk to you about is flight status. So what we just showed you with capacity was pure scheduled data. So scheduled data is what the airlines provide to us in their schedule filings for the future for flights that they plan to fly, they plan to sell, and they plan to market. This graph right here, is showing you operated flights. So this is your true percentage of operated flights, the actual metal that got into the air, the cancellations, and the unknown flights. And this is important for understanding your capacity because you have to take into account the cancellations, you have to take into account the unknown flights. And basically what unknown flights are and what gray flights are, that we coined them gray flights, are flights that are on the scheduling database, but when it comes to the day of the flight doesn't activate. So there isn't a flight plan filed. There isn't, that flight has been pulled from the airline's, effective schedule, usually within, 5 days before the date of operation. But they haven't updated their schedule filings. So that flight is still on their schedule filings, but it's not actually going to fly. They've pulled it from their schedule, internally. They're going to move passengers around and get them on different flights. Sometimes passengers take other flights. Sometimes passengers are going to go to, a different airport for their destination, for their, departure port. So you have to take these unknown counts into effect when you're modeling for future capacity because it drags it down. So if you take a look at, February, this is a graph from December 2020 to March of 2021. And I'll call your attention kind of to the upper right-hand, quartile. You'll see in yellow and gray at the top that the yellows are the cancellation counts and the light grays are the unknown flights. And if you look from, the end of February through March, you're going to see that the unknown flights kind of are steady at about 10%. And then, the cancellations are going down towards the middle of March, but you're still probably running a 3 to 4, 5% cancellation mark. In February, the cancellation rate was much higher. It's because there was a spike of capacity on the database, and then they had to cancel off some flights. But, in general, the global operated flights is looking about, between 85 to like 87%. So that means, between 15 and 13% of flights are either canceled or unknown. So that's, depending on your market and depending on, your airport, that could be a sizable amount of capacity that you're thinking is going to flow through your airport, but is really, it's not there. It's either customers are, getting moved onto different flights and the capacity is reduced by a flight being canceled, or the flight never makes it to the activation side, and that capacity for that particular flight is basically null and void. So it's kind of taken off it's taken off the effective schedule, even though it's still on their schedule. So the point here is you have to understand what your true operational percentage is when you're modeling for future capacity. And you kind of have to create a running average of, if we're in this COVID time, we're going to have, a certain percentage of flights canceled, and we're going to have a certain percentage of flights that are gray flights or otherwise known as unknown flights. And those are kind of, effectively removed from the scheduling database, even if the airline themselves doesn't do it. So you always want to keep an eye out on what your operated flight percentage is. And that can be garnered through flight status data, which you could either, get from a historical standpoint in a raw data file, or through, if you get it through Viovo, you can cache that flight status information and figure out, what your cancellation rate, but you have to go a little bit deeper to get the gray flight and the unknown rate. So the third data set I want to talk about is booking data. So in particular, future booking data. The problem we usually look, from a route forecasting and a network planning perspective, we usually look at historical bookings as like our benchmark. The problem is that for 2020, your historical bookings are so out of whack that you don't really have the baseline that you need to compare against for the upcoming year. You could use 2019 data, but that data is, so stale and routes have been removed that the two comparable data sets might not be the same. So what we do is we use forward-looking bookings. And the future bookings that we get are in a partnership with one of the GDS's Travelport. So we work with Travelport to produce future bookings through the MIDT data set. And some of you in the airport world have probably heard of the MIDT's data set. So our future bookings are from the GDS systems. So from your Sabre, your Amadeus, your Travelports, they're amalgamation of their booking data on a future outlook. The historical data that we produce is factored up to 100% of the market, but the future bookings is purely what's booked on the GDS. So we have to make some assumptions when we're using this data. So the assumptions that have to be made are you don't want to take the number that is coming from our future bookings as a hard and fast number, but when you're doing your future your future demand modeling for your airport or your market, you need to use that as an estimator, and you're going to have to factor it up for a particular, whatever your O&D pairs are. If you're looking at all your outbounds or your inbounds, you're going to have to kind of use a factorization process. But what it does is it gives you a good baseline to look at what is the future demand looking like in my region, in my at my airport, in terms of GDS bookings. And you also have to take into account in different parts of the world, the GDS system have better penetration than they do in North America is good penetration, but in other parts of the world it could be less so because of the the low cost carriers and more people booking direct through the airline. So you have to take that into account. But again, it's a good estimator of how you want to look at future demand. So this graph right here is just future bookings for April, May, and June of 2021 by region. And you'll see that for April, and again, these are just GDS bookings, so you're gonna have to factor them up. But we're seeing good spikes in North America for both April, May, and June. Good spikes in Western Europe, and then some good spikes in Asia. And if you compared this against the previous months, you would probably see, when you compare these, against an average, booking line, that these are going to be higher than the previous months, bookings. And the way to do that is to basically compare it against what the future capacity is. Well, another thing that I want to add about bookings is the bookings that we produce are on a monthly basis. So they're not granular down to the day or to the flight number, but they give you a good idea of how traffic is changing on a month by month basis. So the granularity you can get is by airline, by O&D pair, and by month. So again, this gives you a good estimation of how you're going to see and understand passenger flows in and out of your airport. So you can do it by airport base too, and which airlines are performing the best in terms of bookings down the line. So here is a graph of kind of weaving the schedules and the booking data together. So we've taken an approach of comparing the previous year's booking data. So this is an example for 2019 and 2020, and creating basically a correlation ratio, the bookings versus the capacity trend. So the idea is to take the previous year's bookings, the previous year's capacity, and create kind of a correlation ratio to find out on a scale, of 0 to 1, what is the recovery status of a particular route given the metrics that we can look at right now. So we basically take the latest bookings. So this is for the route of Heathrow to Miami for 2020, so June of 2020. So this is a historical kind of look back, because we haven't done too much analysis in 2021 just yet. It's a historical look back at the latest bookings for June versus the previous year for June on the database for travel in July of 2020. And then the latest planned capacity for June and latest capacity the latest capacity taken in June, but planned for July. So you'll see down here, the July in the graph, the July seats for 2019, the capacity is obviously higher than what was in July 2020. So you're seeing a dip here. And then the July bookings for 2019, obviously higher, that were on the database at the same point in time than the July bookings for 2020. So what we do is we take the percentage difference for each of the bookings and each of the planned capacity, and we divide those up and get a ratio. So the ratio for this travel in July, taken in a snapshot in June of 2020, is 0.52. So we come down here to our scale, and we've tried to put this into a scaled perspective of what the network planning teams at the airlines are trying to do in terms of capacity, and in trying to kind of pinpoint demand. So you'll see the three sectors here. Capacity likely to be reduced. So if it's essentially below 0.5, you can kind of think that the capacity is going to get cut again. The capacity under review. So from 0.5 to 0.6 to about 0.7, and then capacity likely to return anything above 0.7 to 1. So for this ratio, you're really hovering around, you're in capacity under review, but, depending upon what happens in the next month, because the snapshot was taken in June, the July capacity for that month was probably reduced, and it probably came down even further. So you can see that, closer into the date of operation, the volatility still remains. So there could have been further reductions in the capacity. And then if you looked at the flight status data, the operated data, you would probably notice that there are probably some cancellations and, a further reduction in capacity with unknown flights. So our suggestion here to be, probably to expect more capacity to be reduced on this route in July for, it was probably cut down in June of that year. And the last point I want to make is about our schedules and flight status data and how you can automate that data, and in a way bookings too. Bookings through our traffic analyzer product. But the key here for schedules data is you have so much volatility, and flight status is so, it's a fluid data set, right? So it's ever changing. You're getting cancellations, you're getting delays, you're getting, gate updates, you're getting aircraft swaps. The fluidity on the flight status side, you have to have a real-time automated process to really understand what's going on at your airport on any daily basis for resource planning, for predictability of what's to see what the problem flights might be for that day. You have to have that real-time data information to come in and track volatility. And that data that we provide, especially the flight status data, is available in API format. So is the schedule data. But the flight status data in API format is easily driven through, Veovo take in our data right now. They pass it in through their flight management platform. They can use it for predictability. They can use the schedule data for, to help you guys with resource planning, looking at looking at the future capacity and having, a daily update of future capacity. So knowing how to plan for additional resources to bring back, how to plan to talk to your tenants when they are, the concessionaires and tenants to know when to reopen, to know when to scale up, to understand, how the future is looking. And also you can use the flight status data to aid in prediction of passenger flows through the airport. So we, through the API data and through the booking data, you can get a good feel for what we call footfall. So a lot of our concessionaires, they take our data and they model it together with the scheduled data, seat capacity, the actual operational data. So when is the aircraft going to be in gate, when's it going to be out gate, and then the booking data to know how many butts are in the seats essentially, and how they can model the footfall in their in their terminals, in their by gate, so they can see how many people are going to be passing through their airport or passing by their concessionaire stations or by their stores, and then estimate that capture rate to kind of estimate future revenues. And again, the optimizing the resource planning with future schedules, it's the schedules is really, if I can leave you with something today, the schedule is really the base of all your analysis. Without the future capacity, you really don't have a good starting point to understand how your day of operation is going, and then how to kind of model together the future demand. You got to have that base capacity, that understanding of number of seats into your market, into and out of your market, to really begin your modeling for future demand. You're modeling for, when you're going to be able to bring people back on, when you're going to be able to reopen your stores. The capacity is key, and having that capacity knowledge, and then tweaking it a little bit with the operational data, tweaking it with the booking data, and creating your kind of ratios to how the recovery is going to go. That's really how you want to model your your future planning for, in terms of scheduled flight capacity. So if I can leave you with anything, that is the most important part, is focus on the capacity first, and then tweak it as you go down the line, and you add in different data sets to come up with your kind of your forecast model for for the future, for understanding when passengers are going to start flying again. Weaving together all those data sets is important. and it brings together the different ideas of the flight schedules, flight status, and bookings being, the future for your airport operations and understanding, how many passengers are going to be flowing through your airport. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'm going to pass it back over to Chris now for some Q&A.
Thanks, Seth. Very much appreciated. Fascinating to see the trends underpinning airline capacity and airport operations and the value of data and data science applied to those trends. A question that jumps out at me as you went through that is there any new data set that you relied more heavily on in this time of volatility versus pre-COVID times? Is there anything that was a real eye-opener for you and OAG as a result of the environment we're operating in at the moment, that perhaps you didn't have the data or the quality of the data necessarily, or the granularity of the data to really make the assumptions and the analytics that you wanted to make?
Yeah, there certainly was. So on the operational side, when I talked about the gray flights, that was a real eye-opener for us, because in good times, the network planning team and the operational teams at airlines, they have fine-tuned their demand. So they don't want to provide, under capacity, they want to provide over capacity. They had very, very, very fine-tuned how many flights they needed to be flying, where they needed to be flying, how many seats needed to be in those markets, and to optimize, their operational costs, right, and their revenue. But in COVID, they just didn't have everything was changing so quickly. They didn't have the demand numbers. They didn't have it fine tuned. So what they would do is, in very, a lot of instances, they would put too much capacity on particular routes, because they need to get those airplanes flying to make money. But if there's not going to be enough people, on a particular flight, they're going to cancel it and move it around. So those unknown flights, like 3, 4, 5, 6 days out, that we would see, they'd still be on the scheduling database, but then when it would come to the day of operation, you would get no active flight notification from them. You would get no flight plan filed. So in a way, it just kind of, in our world, it kind of disappeared. So we had to create this gray flight. The unknown percentage before COVID was minuscule, and now it was, sometimes it can reach up to 10%, because they just don't have a great foresight into the demand, and they're shuffling things around so last minute that you have to take into account those what we call unknown flights or gray flights, that they're going to change, how the capacity is really reflected, the actual true operational capacity into your market. And that was one data set that really was eye-opening for, especially in 2020.
Yeah, I'm sure. Thank you, Seth. Fascinating to see the trends underpinning airline capacity and how that impacts airport operations.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you.
Thank you.